So next up is Brian Trueman from Sprue Safety Products. Brian is the area specification manager covering Scotland, Northern Ireland and Northern Ireland. He's worked with Sprue for 2 years assisting social landlords, architects and contractors in developing effective home safety solutions tailored to individual requirements. In the last 2 years he's helped the industry in Scotland and Northern Ireland to get to grips with legislative changes with relation to carbon monoxide. He's eager to help the Irish market adapt to revisions within Part J of the regs and with a likely future regulation that may follow on from this. He's also working closely with social landlords to help them improve independent living conditions for residents who suffer with ongoing health issues that could limit their ability to respond to a fire or a carbon monoxide leak within their home, which is obviously a very, very serious issue. So, over to Brian. Thanks.
Thanks very much for the introduction. Thanks very much to Alan and his team for arranging the conference today, allowing me to come and talk to you guys about carbon monoxide. If I can find the presentation, there it is. There we go. So before I get into the CPD part of the presentation, where I'm kind of restricted in talking about my own products and my own company, I'm going to give you a very brief introduction to who Sprue actually is. Many of you might not be familiar with Sprue as a company, but hopefully you'll be familiar with some of the brands that we operate under. So I'll give you a very, very brief introduction to who we are, and then we'll get into the CPD part of the presentation itself. So about us, we design, manufacture and supply products that save lives. We're a specialist in home safety, and so everything we do, every product we make, is designed purely with home safety in mind. So we've got a head office in Coventry in the UK. Sprue was formed in 1998 by our current MD, who's an electrical inventor, if you like, Nick Rutter, who's our MD still today. We now employ over 100 people in the UK-based operations, and every product we design is designed by UK designers for the European market. A number of organisations we work very closely with and have sole supply to. So, you know, the likes of British Gas, for example, will only use our products. 95% of fire and rescue services in the United Kingdom will only fit one of our smoke alarms. So we've got some very good sole supply endorsements. As I say, we're a young company, up and coming, making a big noise in this area with innovative new products in this field. Now on to the CPD part of the presentation. This really is a guide to residential carbon monoxide safety. So what it will basically do is give you some best practice mixed with legislation, mixed with new technologies that exist within the marketplace, some of which have only been around in a matter of months. What we're going to cover, what is carbon monoxide, where does it come from, hopefully dispel any myths that might be out there, what are the effects of carbon monoxide, then we're going to look at sort of risks. So I've kind of categorised it into two segments. So we've got the generalised risk to the general public, and then individual risks within the home that people may or may not have considered when they look at things like carbon monoxide. Obviously we'll touch on regulations and standards, and I'll give you a case study of some best practice in action. This really is an hour presentation, which I'm going to try my best to work through very, very quickly. So I'm going to skim through the first 2 points, because I think a lot of people in the room are probably up to speed with all of this already. Apologies if I'm rushing through certain points, but I will be available at the end if anyone wants to go into any more detail on any of this. And what I want to really focus on is the risk section, because I think that's where you'll get the most value from this. So what is carbon monoxide? It's an invisible, colourless gas, no taste, no smell. This advert tries to sort of highlight the point. You can't see it, you can't smell it. The only way of determining it's there is with some form of an alarm. Where does it come from? Really anything that burns fuel or is going to produce carbon monoxide is a byproduct from that. So gas and oil boilers, wood burners, open fires, block chimneys we heard about earlier from Nicola, the tragic story there, and broken and cracked flues. The one I want to really draw attention to though is in the bottom right hand corner there. We see carbon monoxide coming through bricks and mortar. We had a case in Northern Ireland not that long ago where there was a semi-detached house. There was a fault with the appliance which caused carbon monoxide to leak into the property. That property didn't have a carbon monoxide alarm, but the one joined onto it did. And the alarm activated next door to say there was a CO leak somewhere. and next door having a CO alarm saved both families' lives. So it's really important to stress that you might think that you've got no fuel burning appliances in your house or flat, but what about next door? How do you know that you're not protecting yourself from what they're doing next door? You know, we've seen cases with, you know, particularly with some foreigners who've come over doing ethnic cooking styles where they basically almost have barbecues indoors, which sounds frightening. But you could be living next door to that and not know it. So that's why it's very important to focus on the fact that CO can come from adjoining properties. So having an alarm could protect you from your neighbours, essentially. What are the effects of CO poisoning? It could be the signs of a good night out, or it could be carbon monoxide poisoning, is what we're trying to say in this advert. It starts off with a headache, a bit of nausea, you could be out of breath, you could collapse and be dizzy. And at the most serious end of the scale, you can lose consciousness and die. And so this is why it's very, very difficult for people to diagnose, is it carbon monoxide that I've been subjected to here, or is it simply the flu? Am I working too hard? You know, is it stress? It could be a number of different symptoms which may or may not be carbon monoxide. The only way to definitively tell that it is carbon monoxide is with a blood test. Going to the doctor, and the doctor arranges a blood test for it. So, now, what are the effects of carbon monoxide poisoning? These are some statistics that have come from the NHS in the UK. I've struggled a little bit to get specific figures for Ireland, unfortunately, but hopefully we're not too different in terms of, you know, these figures can be attributed and factored in. So, on average, we're seeing about 50 deaths per year in the UK. These are fatal incidences of CO poisoning in the UK. But moreover than that, what we see is more than 200 people who are seriously injured by carbon monoxide poisoning to the point that they're actually taken to hospital in an ambulance. They're rendered unconscious. Some of these cases will involve permanent brain damage. So, although carbon monoxide can kill you, if you're exposed to dangerous levels of it, but you don't die, you can still end up with severe brain damage or other long-term illnesses as a result of the exposure. Sometimes that gets forgotten about. So, unfortunately, there are 200, on average, 200 odd cases that are in the serious bracket, serious but not fatal bracket. And then there are more than 4,000 people who are poisoned. They go into hospital of their own volition with symptoms that I mentioned earlier, and then the blood test diagnoses that they've actually been poisoned. So this is what you would call relatively moderate poisoning, where, you know, it's not serious, it's not fatal, but someone's still got a doctor's note to say they've been poisoned. So 4,000 cases a year is a high number. And that's really where legislation's been brought in that we'll come and touch on later on to try and address that fact. So the current situation is that awareness of carbon monoxide is increasing all the time. We're seeing it on television, in the news, it's been on soaps. The general public as a whole is far more aware of CO now than what they ever have been. So these deaths are entirely preventable. There's no excuse for any of these statistics that we showed up earlier. If everyone had an alarm, these things wouldn't happen, wouldn't be an issue. Now, there's a lot of parallels we can draw with smoke alarms in this. Back in the 1980s, smoke alarm ownership was around about 10% of houses had a smoke alarm. And very, very frequently you would read about someone dying in a house fire or chip pan fire. These sort of things were commonplace. Today, smoke alarm ownerships is about 85% of houses have smoke alarms now. Most people wouldn't think twice about it. They understand the risk, and they understand what they need to do to meet that risk. Carbon monoxide ownership at the moment is around about 15%. It's probably slightly higher than that in Ireland, because there has been legislation that exists in Ireland that doesn't exist in England and Wales. So 15 to 20% of houses have CO alarms. We estimate by about 2017 that figure could rise to about 50% of houses, and eventually we'll get to the same sort of level we're at with smoke alarms. So we've been over the course before with smoke alarms, learnt lessons on how we've adapted that, and we're now trying to do the same with CO alarm to get that figure higher. So who's at risk from carbon monoxide poisoning then? Well, essentially everybody. Everybody in this room, if they were exposed to dangerous levels of CO, would ultimately die. Nobody would survive it. However, some people are more at risk than others. And that's what the point I want to try and really draw on today. There are certain groups within society, certain people who would suffer far greater consequences from carbon monoxide poisoning than someone who's young, fit and healthy. So we're going to look at that in a little bit more detail. So As I mentioned earlier, I've categorised this in two sections. We've got the general risk and individual risk. And we're going to look at how to manage these risks, what the risks actually are, and what's available to you as landlords or installers to help mitigate these risks. So let's look at the general risk then. So the general risk to the population. I mentioned earlier, everyone will suffer if they're exposed to dangerous levels of CO. So the only way to make sure everyone is safe is by installing some form of an audible carbon monoxide alarm. One in every home is a minimum standard, and that deals with the general risk for the population. And that goes hand in hand with regular servicing and maintenance of appliances, as a sort of footnote. If you then choose to fit a carbon monoxide alarm, what should you look for from the alarm itself? So, first and foremost, the alarm needs to be kite marked to prove that it conforms to the European standard for carbon monoxide alarms, EN 50291. What does that standard actually look for? Well, the standard relates to how quickly the alarm should respond to carbon monoxide in the air. And this table shows you what the European standard actually asks for. So you are not allowed to sell a carbon monoxide alarm in Europe unless it can be proven to meet this standard. So if it's 50 parts per million of carbon monoxide alarm in the air, the alarm has between 60 and 90 minutes to respond to that. If there's 100 parts per million, 10 to 40 minutes. And if there's 300 parts per million or more than that, the alarm has got to respond in less than 3 minutes. So effectively what you're seeing here is that as the risk to health increases, the alarm has to be more and more sensitive to that. There's a fine balance to be struck here, because in the air at the moment, we're sitting here in the room just now, there's probably 8 or 9 parts per million in the air just now. And it's perfectly fine, the body can deal with that, the body can regulate it, it's not an issue. You could live in a terraced house off a main road and a motorbike could backfire outside the front door. You're going to get a cloud of carbon monoxide come into that room, which could take it above 50 parts per million, but it'll disperse very quickly and the fresh air will dilute that. So that's why this 60 to 90 minutes has been brought in, because they're saying, well, you don't want the CO alarm going off every time a motorbike's backfired outside, when there's not actually a risk to health. So it's balancing the risk between sort of nuisance alarms, if you like, that are generally attributed to smoke alarms. You don't get nuisance alarms or CO alarms because of this standard. So if a CO alarm activates, you know that you've got a serious incident to deal with. Now, by having the alarm kite marked, it generally means that it's a case of don't take our word for it, that it meets this standard. A third party has come in and assessed the alarms every 6 months to make sure that they do respond when they're supposed to respond. So a kite mark is something to look for. What else do you want to look for from a CO alarm? Well, obviously you want the sensor is the most important part of the alarm. And so you want to make sure, well, who manufactures the sensor? Is it a third party? Is it the actual alarm manufacturer itself? How does the manufacturer then test the sensor? Do they batch test it? Do they test every single alarm in gas before it leaves the factory? There are numbers of different ways, questions you can ask there. Does the alarm have a memory feature? So some alarms these days have a feature where you can get the life history of that alarm on a report at any time, just by sending the alarm back to the manufacturer. They can tell you the last 10 events where the alarm is activated and give you date and time and how much CO is recorded in the air at any given time. So the memory feature can be really useful if there's a health and safety investigation to follow up on following a CO leak, particularly if you're a landlord. So again, you might want to look for that. There's a debate really between mains and battery alarms. Should we be fitting mains, should we fit batteries? There's pros and cons to both effectively, and both are acceptable in legislation. But if you are fitting a battery one, obviously you're going to want the longest life battery possible. Some alarms now go up to 10 years. And essentially you want that battery to be sealed in, because what you don't want is people ripping out the batteries to use for the TV remote when the TV remote is chucked in. So sealed for life battery, ideally is what you want to look for in that. Where should you fit CO alarms? And Nicola kind of covered this a bit in the previous one, so I'll skim through this. I'll tell you more where you shouldn't install them, I think. Don't put them anywhere in a bathroom or a very humid condition. Humidity can sometimes tamper with the sensor. Don't put them above windows or door frames, where you're going to get fresh air, possibly diluting the results from the CO alarm. And don't put them next to extractor fans or air vents, is essentially the best advice. That covers the sort of generalised risk in terms of the general risk to the public. And I want to spend a bit of time now looking at the needs of individuals, because not everyone's the same. Everyone's got different needs from a health point of view. So, as I mentioned earlier, some people are more vulnerable than others to carbon monoxide. There's some groups of different categories here that I'm going to just skim through with you and explain why they might be more susceptible to carbon monoxide than someone who's young, fit or healthy. The first one on the list, asthmatics. I'm an asthmatic myself, I've got asthma. Generally speaking, people with asthma breathe twice as much as people who don't have asthma. So if I'm breathing twice as much as you who's fit and healthy who doesn't have asthma, I'm bringing in twice as much CO. So I've got less time to respond to the alarm than someone who's young, fit or healthy who doesn't have asthma. So there's a little thing there. Alcoholics or drug addicts. They are scientifically proven not to hear high pitches. So they might not hear the carbon monoxide alarm that's going off because they're under the influence of drink or drugs. And that's part of the reason why we generally see a lot of alcoholics who unfortunately have been killed in chip pan fires. It's because the smoke alarm goes off, but they don't hear it because they can't hear the high pitches. There's been studies into that which can prove this. Also, there's an act of confusion. If you're under the influence of drink or drugs, how do you, when the alarm is going off, how do you know what action to take? It could be a confusion which ends up, unfortunately, killing it. Mobility issues. If someone is physically not able to get out of bed, what good is a CO alarm going off? Because it sounds very morbid, but the CO alarm might just be waking them up to tell them they're about to die if they can't physically get out of the house. So, how do you protect someone with mobility issues with carbon monoxide? Mental health problems, again, you could have instances where they just don't know what to do when the CO alarm goes off and how to react to that risk. People with hearing difficulties. What's the point in putting in a CO alarm if the person's deaf? They're not going to hear it, but they need to be protected from carbon monoxide the same as you or I. So how do you manage the risk for someone like that? People with a reduced immune system, so that generally means women who are pregnant, the elderly, are generally at a reduced immune system, which means that if they breathe in carbon monoxide, it's going to cause them more harm quicker than what it would for someone who's young, fit or healthy. So effectively, I've categorised this and summed it up in 3 sections. Can they hear the alarm? Will they understand the alarm? And do they need extra time to respond to the alarm? Those are the 3 questions I think every landlord needs to ask before they then can say they've met that risk fully. So there's specific solutions to these risks. These are some products, this is technology that exists in the market now to meet these risks. So is there anything that could prevent someone hearing an alarm? That's the first question I asked earlier. There's a low frequency sounder. So I mentioned earlier some people can't hear high pitches. Well, this emits a deep pulse, really loud deep pulse, whenever a CO alarm goes off. So it wirelessly talks to a CO alarm, runs predominantly, we're talking predominantly battery RF product here. It's very easy to install. Can be used with smoke and CO alarms. It will go off and it will give you a deep, bassy, boomy sound when it goes off. So it's not just alcoholics or drug addicts who benefit from this. When you start to lose your hearing through old age, it's the high-pitched stuff you fail to hear first. You could hold a conversation like we are now, but if the alarm went off, you would never hear it because your hearing starts to miss out the high-pitched stuff. So people like that would benefit from a low-frequency sounder. The other option for someone who's got more significant hearing difficulties is a flashing strobe and a vibrating pillow pad. So essentially, if the CO alarm activates, the flashing strobe will flash like mad, very, very bright, and the pillow pad will vibrate underneath the pillow at night to tell the person that there's an incident they need to respond to. So this is how you help the deaf and the hard of hearing, or anyone who might not hear an alarm, CO or smoke. What if there's something that might prevent someone from responding to an alarm? So I mentioned the example earlier, the person who physically can't get out of bed to deal with that CO alarm going off. Well, there's now technology that exists which will shut down the boiler in the presence of CO. So it's again, wireless battery CO alarm, talks to a control box at the boiler, which is wired in between the fuse spur and the boiler. And if it picks up CO, it will shut down the boiler. So effectively, it could switch off the CO for that person who's not physically able to get out of bed and respond to that CO. It's very simple. The only hard wiring involved is between the fuse spur and the boiler with the control box. Everything else is battery RF. So it's installed typically in less than an hour with no real upheaval or hassle. There's also a product within this which is designed to monitor concealed flues. We heard earlier about a lot of the issues with flues. And the product can now be inserted into the void space to monitor flues for cracks and leaks. And again, if it picks up CO, it shuts down the boiler, switching off the source of the CO. So that provides extra assistance for anyone who might not be able to react to a CO alarm, or anyone in that category who needs extra time to respond because of the health issues that they have. So that's general and specific risks. I'm just going to touch a bit on regulations. I'm not going to go too heavy into it because I think Nicola covered it very well previously. England and Wales, you only have to fit CO alarms if you're fitting solid fuel appliances. Northern Ireland and Scotland both made it mandatory for any fuel burning appliance must have a CO alarm fitted. That includes gas, oil, wood, whatever. That came in the last, Scotland was last year, Northern Ireland was the year before. If we're looking at Ireland, Part J, October this year, new or replacement open flue or flueless appliances, but not cookers, must have a compliant CO alarm fitted. And I highlight the word compliant because there are certain criteria the alarm has to achieve in order to meet these regulations. So the alarm must meet the European standard that I highlighted earlier to you. And in Ireland, they actually created a sort of an add-on to that standard to say that the alarm needs to have an end-of-life warning, to tell you when that alarm needs to be replaced. So it doesn't just die one day from the battery finishing. You get a warning for a few weeks to go out and replace it. One alarm in any room containing the appliance, and then one alarm within 5 metres of every bedroom. That's measured along the corridor. And what's not on there is you also need to then put another alarm in the room if a flue passes through a living room or bedroom, just to protect from any leaks within the flue. Now I just want to bring you, before I finish, onto a case study, where a best practice case study, if you like, to look at the sort of general risk within social housing. New Home Homes are a large housing association in England, and they identified that they didn't have carbon monoxide alarms in any of the properties they had, but they wanted to make sure that all houses were protected from the risk, general risk, one. They actually won a Corgi Safety of the Year Initiative Award for the work that they did. And what they basically came up with, to try and balance safety and cost and everything else within the housing stock, they specified a battery alarm with a 10-year warranty and 10-year life. They wanted very simple instructions for the tenant, so very simple LEDs. They wanted the memory feature that I mentioned about earlier. And they found that to cover all 15,000 houses that they earmarked, the quickest and cheapest way to do that was to get the service contractor who was in doing the boiler servicing to add on a CO alarm at the boiler service stage. Every house that they own is going to be serviced once a year, so they said from year one we're going to put a CO alarm in at the boiler service stage, and we can then sleep easy for years 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, whatever, knowing that every house is protected to the same standard from year one. It also meant they were able to go out to the market and buy in bulk. So rather than buying 1,000 alarms a year, they could buy 10,000 alarms a year and get a far better deal from the merchant and from the contractor for fitting that number of alarms. So it ticked loads of boxes for them to do it that way. And at the end of that 10-year cycle, they just go back out and do exactly the same thing again. So it's a very simple way of managing CO across the whole housing stock. I just really want to sum up by saying, we all know that carbon monoxide is a killer, but all of the deaths are entirely preventable. And what I would try and urge you to look at within your own organisations is, what do you do to meet the general risk, and how do you look at the individual risks for the residents that you're working for? I've got examples of some of these products if anyone wants to come and see me later. But this goes hand in hand, obviously, with installation, making sure that alarms are properly installed and maintained, and appliances are installed properly and maintained as well. But hopefully it's been useful. I've tried to condense everything into the sort of time that we've got, so hopefully we've covered everything as well. But if anyone wants to speak to me later, I'll be around, so please make yourself make known to me. Alright, thanks very much.